The gavel came down with a deafening crack, silencing the murmurs in the packed courtroom. Life imprisonment, Judge Walter Grayson intoned, his voice cold and resolute. His eyes lingered on the 17-year-old defendant, Kadeem Foster, whose trembling hands clutched the edge of the defense table. No! A woman's anguished scream pierced the air. It was Kadeem's mother, Naomi, clutching her chest as if the sentence physically struck her. Judge Grayson glanced at the commotion, his expression unflinching. To him, this was just another case, another statistic. But as the teenager was hauled away in handcuffs, Grayson's gaze shifted briefly to the prosecutor's table, where a familiar face gave him a small, knowing nod. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Grayson retreated to his chambers, where a thick manila envelope sat ominously on his desk. The name on the sender's label made his pulse quicken. Kadeem Foster, case evidence. He hadn't ordered it. Frowning, he opened the envelope and froze as the contents spilled out. Photographs, sworn affidavits, and a flash drive. His hands trembled as he inserted the drive into his computer, the words on the screen making his blood run cold. Evidence withheld during trial. View the video file. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss a single twist. And here's a question to get you thinking. What would you do if you discovered evidence that could expose the truth but risked everything to reveal it? Drop your answer in the comments below. We can't wait to hear your thoughts. 2 months earlier, Kadeem Foster was just a regular 17-year-old navigating the challenges of adolescence in a neighborhood overshadowed by poverty and crime. Despite his surroundings, he had big dreams. He wanted to become an architect and often spent hours sketching designs in a worn notebook his mother, Naomi, had bought him. Life hadn't been easy for the Fosters. Naomi worked 2 jobs, one as a housekeeper, another as a cashier, to keep the lights on and food on the table. Still, they found joy in the little things, like sharing late-night stories and dreaming of a brighter future. Everything changed one fateful evening. Gregory Hall, a wealthy businessman and owner of a prominent real estate firm, was found stabbed to death in the parking lot of his office. The community erupted in outrage, demanding swift justice. Investigators zeroed in on Kadeem after a witness claimed to have seen a young black male fleeing the scene. Adding to the case was a knife found nearby, bearing Kadeem's fingerprints. Kadeem's arrest was swift and brutal. Naomi was at work when the police stormed their apartment, breaking down the door and dragging her son away in handcuffs. Kadeem tried to explain that he had been at the local youth center that evening, tutoring younger kids as part of his volunteer work. But the officers didn't care to listen. To them, he was just another suspect who fit the profile. The media pounced on the story, painting Kadeem as a troubled teen from a broken home. His public defender, overworked and underpaid, struggled to mount a defense against Philip Moran, a prosecutor known for his ruthless tactics. Moran framed the case as an open and shut example of senseless violence. Despite Kadeem's cries of innocence, the evidence appeared damning. Naomi begged the court to see the truth, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a guilty verdict, setting the stage for the grim sentencing that would follow. Kadeem's fate now lay in the hands of Judge Walter Grayson, a man known for his strict adherence to the law and his uncompromising stance on crime. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with tension and curiosity. Naomi Foster sat in the front row, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled tissue. Beside her, a few supporters from her church whispered quiet prayers. The prosecutor, Philip Moran, smirked confidently at his table, while Kadeem sat beside his public defender, his youthful face etched with fear and disbelief. Judge Walter Grayson entered the room, his presence commanding instant silence. Known for his harsh sentencing and rigid approach to justice, he carried the reputation of being a law and order judge. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room before settling on Kadeem, who avoided his gaze. Grayson didn't see a scared teenager. He saw another statistic in a city plagued by violence, a young man who, in his eyes, had made the wrong choices. As the court clerk read the guilty verdict aloud, a ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. Naomi gasped audibly, her tears flowing freely, but Kadeem remained still, as though the weight of the words had paralyzed him. Judge Grayson cleared his throat and began his sentencing remarks, his tone cold and resolute. "This court has reviewed the evidence and considered the severity of this crime," he said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Mr. Foster, you have been found guilty of taking a life in a senseless act of violence. Society must be protected from individuals who show such disregard for human life." Kadeem's hands gripped the edge of the defense table as if holding on for dear life. His lips quivered, but he didn't speak. Naomi stood suddenly, her voice breaking. "Please, Your Honor, he didn't do this," she cried. "You're sending an innocent boy to prison." The gavel came down hard, silencing her. "Life imprisonment," Grayson declared, his voice unyielding. A stunned hush fell over the courtroom, broken only by Naomi's heart-wrenching sobs. Kadeem was led away in handcuffs, his wide, tear-filled eyes briefly meeting Grayson's. For the first time in years, the judge hesitated. That look would haunt him. Naomi Foster sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, the walls closing in on her as the reality of the situation sank in. Her son, her only child, Kadeem, was gone, condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars for a crime he swore he didn't commit. But Naomi wasn't the type to give up. For 17 years, she had fought to give Kadeem a better life, shielding him from the harshness of their world. Now, she was ready to fight for his freedom, no matter what it took. She started with the basics, combing through every piece of evidence presented during the trial. The knife with Kadeem's fingerprints bothered her. Kadeem had no history of violence, and the knife wasn't one she recognized. She also couldn't shake the unease about the timeline. Kadeem was supposed to have committed the crime at a time he was usually volunteering at the youth center. She contacted the center director, who confirmed Kadeem had signed in that evening, but the sign-in sheet had been dismissed as insufficient evidence during the trial. Next, Naomi turned to her community for help. Church friends, neighbors, and even Kadeem's former teachers rallied around her. With their support, she started a fundraiser to hire a private investigator. After weeks of calls and prayers, she found Derek Kane, a former cop turned investigator with a reputation for exposing corruption. Kane was skeptical at first. "I've seen a lot of parents who can't admit their kid made a mistake," he said bluntly. But after Naomi showed him the sign-in sheets, eyewitness inconsistencies, and her meticulous notes, he agreed to take the case. "Let's see what we can uncover," Kane said. Within weeks, Kane's investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies. The eyewitness who claimed to have seen Kadeem had recanted their statement, saying they were pressured by the police. The knife, supposedly the murder weapon, bore no traces of Gregory Hall's DNA. Kane also discovered surveillance footage from a nearby store showing a different man running from the scene that night. With new evidence in hand, Naomi felt hope stirring in her chest for the first time. The fight was just beginning. Derek Kane's investigation into Kadeem's case began to uncover more than he had anticipated. As he dug deeper, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold: whispers of a conspiracy. It wasn't just about Kadeem being wrongfully convicted. It was about something far bigger, something that could shake the very foundations of the justice system. The first break came when Kane spoke to a former detective who had been involved in the investigation. The detective, now retired and reluctant to talk, initially hesitated, but finally confided in Kane. "There was pressure from the prosecutor's office to close this case quickly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They wanted a conviction, and Kadeem fit the bill. The Hall family was influential. They wanted justice, and they wanted it fast." Kane's suspicions grew as he reviewed the case files. Prosecutor Philip Moran had been in charge of the case from the beginning, and his tactics were questionable. The evidence, or rather the lack of it, seemed to have been deliberately overlooked. Moran had made no effort to investigate the alibi that Kadeem's defense team had presented, an alibi that was now corroborated by the surveillance footage. More disturbingly, Kane found that Moran had been in frequent contact with Gregory Hall's family, especially with Hall's son, Richard, who had been desperate for a conviction. It didn't take long for Kane to connect the dots. There had been talk of money being exchanged in the shadows, whispers of influence being used to steer the case in a specific direction. Hall's family had made substantial donations to Moran's campaign for district attorney. Kane couldn't help but wonder, had the prosecution been willing to sacrifice an innocent teenager to protect the powerful and wealthy? With his findings, Kane reached out to Naomi. "This isn't just about your son anymore," he said, his voice grim. "There's something much darker at play here. We're up against corruption at the highest levels." Naomi's hands shook as she absorbed the gravity of Kane's words. She had known there was something wrong with the case from the start, but this revelation felt like a gut punch. It was no longer just about proving Kadim's innocence. It was about exposing the rotten core of the system itself. She couldn't back down now. Naomi's mind raced as she paced the small living room, the weight of what she had just learned settling over her like a storm cloud. The truth about Kadim's case was far more complicated than she had imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. Derek Kane's findings painted a damning picture of corruption that reached the highest levels of power in their city. She had to act, but she also knew the risks. After much deliberation, Naomi made a bold decision. She had to get this evidence into the hands of Judge Walter Grayson. Despite his harsh sentencing of Kadim, she believed he was still a man of integrity, and maybe, just maybe, he would listen. The system had failed her son once, but it didn't have to be that way forever. With Derek's help, Naomi put together a package of the most incriminating evidence they had found. The recantation of the eyewitness, the surveillance footage showing another man fleeing the crime scene, the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, and most importantly, the documentation that showed Moran's inappropriate connections to Gregory Hall's family. They sealed it all in a manila envelope and delivered it to Grayson's chambers, anonymously, of course. There was no telling how the judge would react, and Naomi didn't want her name tied to it, not yet. The following days were a blur of anxious waiting. Naomi's heart raced with every knock at the door, every phone call, but the silence from the judge's office was deafening. She couldn't shake the fear that her efforts would be dismissed, that the envelope would sit unnoticed, buried under mountains of other paperwork. Yet, she couldn't stop. The hope that Kadim might have a chance at freedom kept her going. Then, late one afternoon, Naomi received a call. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable, but the message was clear. "Judge Grayson has received your evidence," the voice said, "and he's reviewing it personally." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. The judge was listening. The wheels of justice might finally be turning in the right direction. Judge Walter Grayson sat alone in his chamber. The envelope lay before him, a mystery he hadn't anticipated. His fingers hovered over the sealed edges, hesitant. The weight of the decision ahead pressed on him, heavier than any case he'd ever presided over. It had been a routine day in court when the envelope arrived, hand-delivered by an anonymous messenger. At first glance, it seemed like just another pile of paperwork. But there was something about it, something in the way it was addressed, in the urgency it seemed to carry. His instincts, sharpened by years on the bench, told him this wasn't ordinary. Grayson hadn't heard much from Kadim Foster's defense since the trial. Nothing that would make him question the verdict. Known for his strict stance on law and order, Grayson had believed the evidence presented at the time. Kadim had been found guilty of murder and it had seemed clear-cut. But now, with this envelope sitting in front of him, doubt crept in. He took a deep breath and tore it open. The documents inside were neatly stacked. The first page caught his attention immediately, a recantation from the eyewitness. The key witness, whose testimony had been pivotal, was now admitting they had been pressured to testify falsely. Grayson's fingers trembled as he skimmed through the other evidence. Surveillance footage showing a different man fleeing the scene. Records of the prosecutor's dubious ties to Gregory Hall's family, and an unsettling list of campaign donations from the Hall family to prosecutor Philip Moran. His jaw tightened. Grayson wasn't naive to the whispers of corruption that echoed through the justice system. But this was deliberate. A teenager's life had been ruined, destroyed by a system he had trusted, and Grayson had been complicit in it. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the papers spread across his desk. He had a choice. He could ignore this, let it sink into the abyss of forgotten truths, and continue on his well-trodden path. Or he could act. It was a daunting decision, one that would ripple far beyond himself. For hours, Grayson wrestled with the enormity of it all. Eventually, he realized he couldn't do this alone. He needed someone he trusted, to guide him through the storm that loomed on the horizon. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. "Detective Matthews," a gruff voice answered. "Tom, it's Grayson. I need to see you." There was a pause, then a heavy sigh. "I figured you'd come around eventually." "Where and when?" "The old diner on 5th, midnight." Grayson hung up before Matthews could respond. The diner was an odd choice, quiet, tucked away, and frequented only by night workers and the occasional insomniac. At midnight, it would be nearly deserted. Perfect for a conversation that couldn't risk being overheard. By the time Grayson arrived, the flickering neon sign outside cast an eerie glow over the parking lot. Inside, the diner was almost empty. Matthews sat in the corner booth, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Grayson slid into the seat across from him, setting the envelope on the table. His voice was low, steady. "I've got something that could change everything." Matthews raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Grayson opened the envelope, laying out the documents piece by piece. "It's all here," he said. His voice carried the weight of the truth. Corruption, manipulation, and an innocent man's life on the line. Matthews studied the papers in silence, his expression growing grimmer with each passing moment. Finally, he leaned back, his voice rough. "Walter, if this gets out, it'll destroy you. Your career, your reputation, everything you've built." Grayson's eyes were unwavering. "I didn't come here to protect my career. I came here because I made a mistake, and I need to fix it." Judge Grayson sat in his office the following morning, the sun barely creeping through the blinds. His hand trembled slightly as he reviewed the documents once more. The weight of his decision was unbearable, yet unavoidable. He had spent decades upholding the law, a stern believer in justice and order. But now, standing at the precipice of everything he had built, Grayson was torn. The papers before him were irrefutable. The corrupt ties between prosecutor Philip Moran and Gregory Hall's family. The eyewitness recanting their testimony under duress. The surveillance footage showing a man that was not Kadeem Foster fleeing from the scene of the crime. And the most damning piece of all, the campaign donations that linked Moran to Hall's family. Grayson's stomach churned as he thought of how easily the truth had been swept under the rug. A teenager's life had been destroyed because the right people didn't care to look deeper. He thought of Kadeem, his young face haunted by fear, as he was led away in handcuffs. The anger that had burned in Grayson when he had sentenced him to life. But now, with all the evidence laid out before him, Grayson knew he had sentenced an innocent boy. His mind raced with the possibilities of what could happen next. If he acted on this, it would shake the foundation of everything he had worked for. He could lose his job, his reputation, maybe even his freedom. But in his heart, Grayson knew that ignoring it would be a betrayal of everything he had ever believed about justice. His eyes shifted to the phone on his desk, and for a moment he considered calling Derek Kane or Naomi Foster. But no, the decision had to be his. This wasn't a case to hand off to someone else. Grayson took a deep breath, his jaw tightening with resolve. The judge reached for the phone, dialing a number he had promised himself he would never call again. It rang once, twice, before a voice answered. "Grayson." "I need you to help me," Grayson said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I'm going to need a full investigation, and I need it fast." There was a pause on the other end. "You sure about this?" Grayson's grip on the receiver tightened. "I don't have a choice." Naomi had spent countless sleepless nights pacing her apartment, clutching the glimmer of hope Derek Kane had ignited in her heart. The evidence had been gathered. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the waiting was agonizing. It had been weeks since the package had reached Judge Grayson's hands, and yet there was no word. Was he considering the case? Was he going to act on the new evidence? Or was it all for nothing? Her phone vibrated on the kitchen counter, the sudden sound slicing through the quiet of the early morning. Naomi snatched it up, praying it was news about Kadeem. She hesitated before answering, the knot in her stomach tightening as she saw the number. "Naomi?" The voice was familiar, gruff yet steady. It was Derek Kane. Derek, what's happening? Naomi's voice was sharp, a mix of desperation and hope. I've got news, Derek said, his tone lower than usual. It's not the kind of news I wanted to bring you, but it's time you knew. Naomi's pulse quickened. What do you mean? What's going on? There's been movement on the case. I got word from a source within the court system. Grayson's looking at the evidence. He's taking it seriously, but... Derek paused. It's not just about your son anymore. Grayson's investigation has uncovered more corruption than we thought. Prosecutor Moran and Hall's family have their hands deep in this, but the thing is, they're trying to cover their tracks. They know we're onto them. Naomi's breath hitched. Are you saying they're going to do something to stop this? I'm not sure, but Grayson's reached out to people in the system, powerful people. He's being watched, and those people want him to stop digging. Derek's voice grew more urgent. This is bigger than we thought, Naomi. This could blow up and fast. Naomi's mind raced, the weight of the revelation heavy on her chest. She couldn't lose hope now, not when they were so close. We can't stop, she whispered, determination surging through her veins. We'll fight harder. We can't let them win. The line went silent for a moment before Derek replied, I'll do everything I can, but you need to be prepared. The storm is coming. The tension had been building for weeks, but now it was unmistakable. Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something monumental, something that could either bring justice for Kadeem or shatter everything they had worked so hard for. The news Derek had shared with her had only amplified her fears. The people at the top, those who held the strings, were closing in. She sat in her apartment, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, suffocating her thoughts. Her mind replayed every moment, every conversation she had had in the past few weeks, each one a piece of the puzzle that had led her here. The envelope, Grayson's reluctant investigation, Derek's warnings. It all pointed to a storm that was closing in faster than she could prepare for. Her phone rang again, its shrill sound startling her out of her thoughts. She didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. It was Derek, and his voice on the other end confirmed her worst fears. Naomi, we've got a problem, he said, his voice tense. Grayson's been put under pressure. I'm hearing rumors that Moran and Hall's family are moving in on him. They're trying to shut him down, threaten him. I'm telling you, they're not going to let this go without a fight. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She had expected this, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. The stakes had been raised, and now, more than ever, Kadeem's fate was hanging in the balance. What are they planning to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the growing panic inside her. They'll try to discredit him, smear his reputation, maybe even try to force him into a resignation. But if that doesn't work, Naomi, they'll go after him in ways we can't even imagine. Derek's words hung heavily in the air. We need to move fast. Get the evidence out there before they can bury it all. Naomi's mind raced, the urgency of the situation finally sinking in. She had to act. There was no turning back now. What do we do next? We make our move, Derek said, before they make theirs. Naomi paced the length of her apartment, the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. Derek's words echoed in her mind. We make our move before they make theirs. But what did that mean exactly? What was the right move? And how much risk were they willing to take to expose the truth? The walls of her small apartment felt like they were closing in, and every passing minute seemed to stretch longer than the last. Time was running out, and with each moment, the forces against them were growing stronger. She had no choice now but to trust Derek's instincts, even if it meant putting everything on the line. She glanced at her phone, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for it. She had to contact Grayson. They needed him in this. But reaching out was a dangerous gamble. If Moran or Hall's family knew she was involved, it could jeopardize everything. Grayson had been isolated enough already, but he had reached out for help. Naomi wasn't about to leave him to fight this battle alone. The phone rang, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent room. When Grayson's voice came on the line, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Grayson, she said, her voice low. It's Naomi. We need to talk. There was a long pause before he responded. I know, it's getting dangerous. Moran is making his move. He has people watching me. But I've made up my mind. We have to go public with the evidence soon. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. Naomi's pulse quickened. Are you sure? If we do this, there's no turning back. They'll come after you. After all of us. I know the risks, but Kadeem is innocent, and I can't live with myself if I let this continue. It's time to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Grayson's voice was firm, filled with resolve. Naomi felt a surge of determination. Then we'll do it together. We'll expose them all. The call ended, and Naomi's heart raced. It was a risk, a huge one. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like they were finally on the offensive. They were no longer running from the storm. They were stepping into it, prepared to face whatever came next. The press conference was set. Naomi stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blouse, her reflection staring back at her with a mix of determination and fear. The weight of the moment had never felt more suffocating. This wasn't just about exposing the corruption that had trapped Kadeem. It was about taking down an entire system built on lies and manipulation. She had no illusions about how dangerous this was. Once the truth came to light, there would be no going back. Her phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a text from Derek. It's time. Grayson's in position. She exhaled sharply. This was it. Naomi arrived at the press conference venue. A small, sterile room with bright lights and too many eyes watching. The walls were lined with cameras, their lenses aimed at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but now, standing in front of the podium, the gravity of what was about to unfold hit her. Grayson stood at the back of the room, his gaze locked on her. He had his own part to play in all this, and Naomi trusted him, trusted that they had prepared for this moment. Together, they would take on the giants. The room fell silent as Naomi stepped forward, her palms sweating. She looked out at the sea of reporters and flashed a brief, determined smile. Thank you for coming, she began, her voice strong but steady. Today, we're here to expose the truth that has been buried for far too long. What you're about to see will change everything. She clicked a button on the remote in her hand, and the large projector screen flickered to life. The first image that appeared was the surveillance footage, the one that clearly showed a man running from the crime scene, someone who wasn't Kadeem Foster. The justice system failed Kadeem, Naomi continued, her voice growing more impassioned as the images flashed on the screen. He was wrongfully convicted, manipulated by those who held power, but that's not all. She pressed the button again, and next appeared the documents, campaign donations, hidden connections, and phone records linking Prosecutor Moran to the Hall family. The room fell into stunned silence. Grayson stepped forward, his voice now filling the room. The system is broken, but we have a chance to fix it. The reporters began to murmur, their cameras snapping furiously. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. The truth had been unleashed. Now it was time for the world to see it. The truth has finally been exposed, and the fight for justice is far from over. What would you do if you uncovered corruption this deep? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, share this video to spread the message, and subscribe to join us in uncovering more powerful stories that demand justice. Turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of truth. Together, we can shine a light on injustice and make a difference. Comment below with your thoughts, and let's discuss how we can all play a part in standing up for what's right.